Pit of Despair, 1960s to 1970s. The so-called Pit of Despair refers to a series of extreme isolation experiments conducted by psychologist Harry Harlow at the University of Wisconsin. The official research was part of the Harlow monkey experiments, focused on understanding attachment and emotional development. In the experiment, infant rhesus monkeys were placed into a specially designed vertical steel chamber. This chamber was completely isolated. No light, no sound, no contact with other living beings, just a small confined space designed to prevent escape or interaction. The goal was to study what happens when social and emotional needs are completely removed. The results were devastating. Within days, the monkeys showed extreme behavioral changes. They stopped moving normally. They curled into themselves. They refused to interact even when food was provided. Over time, many developed self-harming behaviors, biting themselves, rocking endlessly, or refusing to eat. When later placed with other monkeys, they couldn't form normal social bonds. Some became aggressive, others completely withdrawn. Harlow called this state psychological despair. The experiments revealed a disturbing truth. Social connection isn't optional for healthy development. It is essential. But the methods used were heavily criticized because of the severe suffering they caused. The Pit of Despair became one of the most controversial examples in psychology history, showing how extreme isolation can break even basic emotional functioning in living beings. The Wave, 1967. In 1967, a high school history teacher named Ron Jones ran a classroom experiment that later became known as the Wave. He wanted to explain to students how ordinary people in Germany could follow authoritarian movements, like Nazism. So he created a fake movement inside his own classroom. He called it the Wave. At first, it looked harmless. He introduced strict rules. Students had to sit perfectly, stand in a certain way, and respond in a disciplined manner. He also enforced slogans like unity, strength, and obedience. Even the smallest actions became controlled. Within just a few days, things changed fast. Students began treating the movement seriously. They gave it a name. They created symbols. They even started recruiting other students from the school. What started as a lesson became an identity. Some students began reporting others who broke the rules. Others became aggressive toward anyone who didn't follow the Wave. The most disturbing part was how quickly they accepted authority without questioning it. Even students who initially thought it was just a game started believing in it. By the end, the teacher realized the situation was getting out of control, and he had to stop the experiment before it escalated further. Then he revealed the truth. There was no real movement, no ideology, no leader, just an experiment. And the reaction shocked everyone. The students finally understood how easily humans can surrender individuality and become part of a system they never questioned in the first place. Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo launched a study at Stanford University that would become one of the most disturbing psychology experiments ever conducted, the Stanford Prison Experiment. The idea sounded simple. 24 ordinary college students were selected and randomly divided into two groups: guards and prisoners. A fake prison was built inside the university basement. At first, it seemed harmless, but the process was designed to feel real. The prisoners were suddenly arrested at their homes by actual police, fingerprinted, searched, and taken to the mock prison. Once inside, they lost their names. They were identified only by numbers. Meanwhile, the guards were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and authority. And almost immediately, things changed. The guards began humiliating prisoners, forcing them to do exhausting exercises, stripping them of privacy, waking them at night, and psychologically breaking them down. Some prisoners became emotionally unstable. Others started obeying completely. What shocked researchers most was how fast normal people transformed. These weren't criminals or trained officers. They were regular students. Yet, within days, the prison environment itself changed their behavior. The situation became so extreme that the experiment, planned for 2 weeks, was stopped after only 6 days. The Stanford Prison Experiment revealed something terrifying. Under the right conditions, ordinary humans can become cruel simply because they're given power over others. Nazi human experimentation, 1930s to 1940s. During World War II, Nazi doctors carried out some of the most horrifying medical experiments in human history, now known as Nazi human experimentation. These experiments took place mainly inside concentration camps, like Auschwitz concentration camp, where prisoners were treated not as human beings, but as disposable test subjects. Victims included Jews, prisoners of war, children, and other civilians imprisoned by the Nazi regime. Many experiments were designed to support the German military. In freezing experiments, prisoners were forced into ice water or left naked in extreme cold for hours, while doctors observed how long it took them to die. The goal was to study survival methods for German soldiers stranded in freezing environments. Other victims were intentionally infected with diseases like malaria and tuberculosis, so researchers could test drugs and vaccines. Some prisoners were exposed to poison bullets or toxic chemicals just to observe the effects on the body. And in some of the most disturbing cases, doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia. Limbs were removed, organs were operated on, people were dissected while still alive. At camps like Auschwitz, Josef Mengele became infamous for experiments on twins and children, often involving injections, mutilation, and forced procedures. Most victims never survived, and those who did were left permanently damaged, physically and psychologically. After the war, the world was horrified when the full details were uncovered during the Nuremberg trials. These experiments became a symbol of what happens when science loses all morality and human beings are reduced to nothing more than objects for experimentation. Robbers Cave Experiment, 1954. In 1954, psychologists conducted a study called the Robbers Cave Experiment to understand one dangerous question: how easily can humans begin to hate each other? The experiment took place at a summer camp in Oklahoma. 22 boys, all around the same age, arrived believing they were simply attending a normal camp, but secretly they were part of a psychological experiment. At first, the boys were divided into two separate groups. They lived apart, ate apart, and spent days bonding only with their own teammates. One group called themselves the Eagles, the other became the Rattlers. As friendships inside each group grew stronger, researchers introduced competition, games, sports, tug-of-war, and prizes for the winners. Almost immediately, things turned hostile. The groups began insulting each other, stealing property, burning team flags, and even preparing physical attacks. The hatred escalated incredibly fast, and that's what shocked researchers most. These were ordinary children with no previous problems, yet simply dividing them into us and them created tribal behavior. But the experiment didn't stop there. Researchers then tried to reduce the conflict by forcing both groups to work together on shared problems, like fixing a broken water supply and moving a truck stuck in mud. Slowly, the hostility faded. The study revealed something deeply unsettling. Humans can form loyalty, division, and hatred extremely quickly, even over meaningless group identities. And once people begin seeing others as the enemy, normal behavior can change frighteningly fast. Human radiation experiments, 1940s to 1970s. During the Cold War, the US government secretly carried out a series of studies now known as the human radiation experiments. The goal was to understand what radiation would do to the human body, especially after the development of nuclear weapons. But many of the people involved had no idea they were being experimented on. Some patients in hospitals were injected with radioactive materials without fully understanding the risks. Others were exposed during medical procedures where proper consent was never clearly given. In some cases, researchers specifically targeted vulnerable people, poor patients, prisoners, military personnel, and even children. One of the most disturbing examples involved terminally ill hospital patients being injected with plutonium, a highly radioactive substance used in nuclear weapons research. Doctors then monitored how the materials spread through their bodies. Another case involved pregnant women being given radioactive substances disguised as nutritional drinks, just to study how radiation affected unborn babies. The victims often trusted the doctors completely. They believed they were receiving treatment or participating in safe research. Instead, they became human test subjects during the race for nuclear knowledge. For years, much of this remained secret. Then, decades later, investigations uncovered documents showing how widespread the experiments had been. What makes these experiments terrifying isn't just the radiation itself, it's the fact that science and national security were used as excuses to ignore basic human rights. People weren't treated like patients, they were treated like data. Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972. The US Public Health Service began one of the most disturbing medical studies in American history, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The experiment involved hundreds of poor black men in Alabama, many of them uneducated sharecroppers. The government told them they were receiving free medical treatment for bad blood. a vague term used at the time for illness and fatigue. But that wasn't the truth. The real goal was to secretly study what untreated syphilis would do to the human body over time. Some of the men already had syphilis, others did not, and instead of properly treating them, doctors intentionally allowed the disease to spread through their bodies for decades. The most horrifying part came in the 1940s, when penicillin became the official cure for syphilis. At that point, the study should have ended immediately, but it didn't. Researchers actively prevented many participants from receiving treatment, even blocking access through local doctors and military programs. The men believed they were being helped, when in reality, they were being observed like test subjects. Over the years, many suffered blindness, mental damage, organ failure, and death. Some unknowingly passed the disease to their wives, and even children. The experiment continued for 40 years, until a whistleblower finally exposed it to the public in 1972. What makes this case terrifying isn't just the disease, it's the fact that the people running the experiment were supposed to be doctors, and instead of saving lives, they chose to watch people suffer in the name of research. Jane Elliott, Classroom Experiment, 1968. In 1968, just one day after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a teacher named Jane Elliott decided to teach her students a lesson about discrimination they would never forget. The experiment became known as the Blue Eyes/Brown Eyes experiment. Her classroom was filled with ordinary elementary school children. At first, everything was normal. Then Jane Elliott divided the class into two groups based on eye color, blue eyes and brown eyes. On the first day, she told the blue-eyed children they were superior, smarter, cleaner, and better than the others. The brown-eyed children were treated as inferior. They received fewer privileges, were criticized more, and were excluded from activities. And almost immediately, behavior changed. Children who had been friendly suddenly became arrogant, rude, and controlling once they were labeled superior. Meanwhile, the children labeled inferior became quieter, anxious, and emotionally affected. Some even performed worse in school tasks simply because they had been made to feel lesser. Then, the next day, Jane Elliott reversed the roles. Now the previously inferior children became dominant, and the cycle repeated itself. What shocked everyone was how quickly prejudice formed. These children weren't naturally hateful. No one taught them years of racism or discrimination. All it took was authority, division, and labels. The experiment revealed something deeply disturbing. Humans can learn discrimination incredibly fast, especially when society tells them who is better and who is less.